The quantum comm sphere pulsed an angry red in the United Earth Defense Council chamber, its light casting ominous shadows across the faces of humanity's leaders. Supreme Admiral Chen watched the alien transmission replay for the fourth time, each viewing deepening the lines around his eyes. The Verax ambassador's crystalline form shifted through shades of deep purple as it delivered its message. Your species claims to be worthy of interstellar recognition, yet you hide behind your quantum shields and AI-driven defense systems. The Verax Empire demands proof of your individual worth. One human champion against our greatest warrior. The challenge will determine humanity's status in the galactic community. Chen's gaze fell on Commander Sarah Reeves, who stood at perfect attention near the chamber's entrance. At 34, she wasn't the most decorated officer in Earth's fleet, nor the most experienced. But she possessed something far more valuable. An understanding of humanity's greatest strength, its unpredictability. They expect us to send our strongest warrior. Chen addressed the council, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. They expect brute force, tactical programming, augmented reflexes. They expect us to think like them. He gestured toward Sarah. That's precisely why we're sending Commander Reeves. The council chamber erupted in whispers. Sarah's service record flashed on their neural displays. Specialist in theoretical xenopsychology, creator of the chaos theory combat doctrine, and notably, someone who had never participated in direct combat operations. Admiral, a council member's voice cut through the murmurs. Commander Reeves has no combat augments, no neural enhancements. The Verax warrior will be twice her size with natural armor capable of deflecting plasma rounds. This is suicide. Sarah stepped forward, her movement drawing all eyes. Counselors, the Verax think in absolutes. Their entire society is built on crystalline structures, perfect symmetry, and predictable patterns. They see strength as a mathematical equation. More mass, more armor, more weapons equals victory. A slight smile crossed her face. They don't understand that humanity's greatest weapon isn't our technology or our physical capabilities. It's our ability to embrace chaos. The quantum sphere pulsed again, reminding them of the waiting Verax fleet beyond Pluto's orbit. Chen nodded to Sarah. Tell them we accept. Tell them we're sending our champion. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparation, but not the kind the Verax would have expected. While their warrior probably underwent intense physical conditioning and combat drills, Sarah spent her time in the cultural archives, studying everything from ancient Earth martial arts to contemporary dance movements. She reviewed historical battles where inferior forces had triumphed through unconventional means. The night before her departure, Chen found her in the holosimulation chamber, but she wasn't running combat scenarios. Instead, she was watching old recordings of street performers, magicians, and sleight-of-hand artists. Most would be practicing their fighting techniques, Chen observed. Sarah's eyes remained fixed on a centuries-old recording of a magician performing the classic cups and balls trick. The Verax see combat as a perfect system, Admiral. But humanity. We turned deception into an art form. We created entire forms of entertainment based on misdirection. We found beauty in the unexpected. She turned to face him, her expression resolute. The Verax warrior will be expecting a fight. Instead, they're getting a performance. The transport ship that would take her to the neutral testing grounds was small, unadorned. The Verax had specified she could bring no weapons, no armor, nothing but herself. They had expected protests, demands for concessions. Instead, Sarah had agreed immediately, another move that didn't fit their patterns. As she prepared to board, Chen handed her a small wooden box. Inside was a simple glass marble, the kind children had played with for centuries. A reminder, he said, that sometimes the simplest tools can change everything, if used with imagination. Sarah pocketed the marble and smiled. The Verax think they're testing our worth as a species, Admiral. But they're about to learn something far more important. She stepped onto the transport's ramp. They're about to learn why humanity survived every catastrophe, every setback, every impossible odds we faced. We don't just think outside the box. We question why there needs to be a box at all. The transport's doors sealed shut, and as it lifted off into the dawn sky, Chen couldn't help but smile. The Varax had demanded a warrior, expecting humanity to play by their rules. Instead, they were getting something far more dangerous. A human who understood that true strength lies not in following the expected path. The neutral testing grounds turned out to be an ancient space station, its hull etched with the markings of a dozen extinct civilizations. Sarah's transport approached the massive structure, which hung in space like a tarnished medallion against the backdrop of a violet nebula. Representatives from 30 different species had gathered to witness the challenge, their vessels forming a glittering constellation around the station. As Sarah's ship docked, she noted how the Varax vessel was positioned precisely at the geometric center of the gathering fleet. Even in something as simple as parking their ships, they couldn't help but follow rigid patterns. She smiled, rolling the glass marble between her fingers as she waited for the airlock to cycle. The station's central chamber was a vast amphitheater, its walls lined with crystalline viewing pods containing delegates from across the galaxy. The Varax champion stood in the center, a towering figure whose crystalline exoskeleton refracted light in mesmerizing patterns. Unlike the ambassador's purple hues, this warrior's crystal structure burned with deep red undertones. "I am Nexus Warrior Vaxthar." The creature's voice resonated through the chamber's translation field. "I will test humanity's worth through perfect combat." Sarah stepped forward, her simple Earth defense uniform a stark contrast to the warrior's natural grandeur. A ripple of what might have been amusement passed through the watching crowds. She looked almost childlike next to the massive Varax. "I am Commander Sarah Reeves," she responded, her voice clear and calm. "But before we begin, I have a question about the terms of this challenge." Vaxthar's crystalline form shifted slightly, a gesture Sarah had studied enough to recognize as confusion. The Varax didn't believe in questions before combat. The rules were always absolute, the parameters fixed. "The terms are combat," Vaxthar stated. "Victory through superior capability." Sarah smiled, pulling out the glass marble. "Then I propose a slight modification, not to the goal, but to the method." She held up the marble, letting it catch the light. "In human history, we had a saying, the best way to understand someone is to play with them." The gathered delegates buzzed with confusion. The Varax warrior's form pulsed with uncertainty. This wasn't following any known protocol. "You mocked the challenge." Vaxthar's tone carried an edge of indignation. "Not at all," Sarah replied, beginning to walk in a casual circle. "I'm suggesting that combat isn't the only way to measure worth. Games require strategy, understanding, adaptation, all qualities that define a species' true capabilities." She rolled the marble across the floor, its path curving in an arc that ended precisely at Vaxthar's feet. The warrior stared down at the tiny glass sphere, crystals flickering with conflicting colors. The Varax pride themselves on perfect structure, on understanding patterns, Sarah continued. "So let's make this interesting. I challenge you to a game of my choosing. If you win, it proves your superiority in both might and mind. If I win..." She let the sentence hang. The chamber had gone completely silent. In the viewing pods, delegates leaned forward, fascinated by this unexpected turn. The Varax council members present shifted through shades of deep blue, their color of intense deliberation. Finally, Vaxthar spoke. "The parameters of this game." "Simple," Sarah said, retrieving the marble. "It's called chaos theory. The station's environmental systems can create holographic obstacles throughout this chamber. We each take turns setting new rules, new patterns. The goal is to get the marble from one end of the chamber to the other. But here's the twist. Each new rule has to work with all previous rules while adding complexity. Break a pattern, and you lose. Create an impossible scenario, you lose. The Verax warriors' crystalline surface rippled with interest. Pattern creation was the foundation of their society. This seemed like a challenge perfectly suited to their strengths. And combat? Vaxthar questioned. "Oh, we'll be fighting," Sarah assured them. "Just not with weapons or fists. We'll be fighting with our minds, our understanding of order and chaos. After all, isn't that a truer test of a species' worth than simple physical combat?" The Verax Council members conferred briefly, their crystals harmonizing in complex geometric patterns. Finally, they signaled their agreement. Sarah noticed how their confidence had actually grown. They believed their mastery of patterns would give them an insurmountable advantage. As the station's systems began generating the holographic playing field, Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in one of the chamber's polished walls. She allowed herself a small smile, remembering Chen's words about the marble being a simple tool that could change everything. The Verax thought they were agreeing to a game of pattern recognition, their greatest strength. What they didn't realize was that Sarah had already begun playing long before she stepped into the chamber. Everything, from her initial question to the rolling of the marble, had been setting up her real strategy. Because humans understood something the Verax couldn't grasp. Sometimes the most perfect pattern was knowing exactly when to break one. The holographic playing field materialized across the chamber floor, creating a shimmering path that stretched for 100 meters. Sarah held the marble up to the light, its glass surface catching and refracting the station's illumination, much like Vaxthar's crystalline form. "As challenger, you may establish the first pattern," Vaxthar announced, confidence resonating through their translator. Sarah nodded, then rolled the marble gently across the floor. It traveled in a perfect straight line for exactly 10 meters before stopping. First rule: the marble must pause every 10 meters. The gathered aliens watched as the station's computers recorded the rule, creating soft checkpoints of light every 10 meters along the path. Vaxthar's crystalline surface rippled with what Sarah recognized as satisfaction. To them, this was the perfect starting point. Logical, measurable, predictable. "Accepted," Vaxthar declared. The warrior raised their arms, and geometric shapes began appearing between each checkpoint. Second rule: at each pause, the marble must navigate through a perfect crystalline structure. The audience murmured as beautiful, complex crystal matrices appeared at each checkpoint. Sarah studied them carefully, noting how each one was slightly more intricate than the last, a progression that would seem natural to a Verax mind. "Accepted," Sarah said. She waited exactly 3 seconds, then added, "Third rule: the marble's speed must increase by 1.618 times between each checkpoint." A subtle tension rippled through the Verax delegation. Sarah had chosen the golden ratio, a number that appeared throughout nature, art, and mathematics. It was logical enough to be acceptable, but introduced an element of acceleration that would make precise control increasingly difficult. The game continued, with each participant adding new rules. Vaxthar introduced gravitational variations, geometric requirements, and precise timing mechanisms. Each rule was a masterpiece of mathematical perfection, building upon the previous ones to create an increasingly complex system. Sarah's additions, however, began to subtly shift the nature of the challenge. She introduced rules about motion that seemed to follow pattern but contained hidden variables. One required the marble to briefly reverse direction, based on the harmonic resonance of the crystal structures, a rule that seemed straightforward but would create unpredictable interactions with Vaxthar's geometric patterns. As the game progressed, Sarah noticed something fascinating in Vaxthar's behavior. The Verax warrior was becoming so focused on maintaining the perfect mathematical progression of their patterns that they were missing the larger picture. They couldn't see how Sarah's seemingly simple rules were creating subtle interference patterns, building towards something bigger. "Remarkable," one of the alien delegates commented. "The human appears to be implementing some form of ordered complexity." But Sarah wasn't implementing order at all. She was introducing chaos. just so gradually that the pattern-obsessed Verax couldn't recognize it for what it was. Each of her rules contained elements that would interact with previous rules in increasingly unpredictable ways, like ripples in a pond combining to form unexpected wave patterns. After the 16th round of rules, the playing field had become a mesmerizing display of geometric shapes, gravity wells, and light patterns. Vaxstar stood tall, crystals gleaming with pride at the perfect system they believed they had helped create. "The pattern is complete," Vaxstar announced. "Now we shall each attempt to guide the marble through the course, demonstrating our understanding of the system we have built." Sarah nodded, but her attention was on something else: the subtle vibrations running through the station's floor from its ancient environmental systems. She had noticed them the moment she arrived, and every rule she had added was designed to work with these barely perceptible oscillations. "Protocol dictates the challenger attempts first," Vaxstar stated. Sarah picked up the marble, its cool surface familiar against her skin. "Before I begin, I have a question about rule interpretation." She pointed to her third rule about speed progression. "Does the rule specify that the acceleration must be constant between checkpoints, or only that the final speed at each checkpoint must follow the ratio?" The Verax warrior's crystals flickered briefly, the equivalent of a dismissive gesture. "The rule states only the ratio requirement. The path between checkpoints is irrelevant, as long as the mathematics are correct." Sarah smiled. It was exactly the answer she had expected. The Verax were so focused on the points of measurement, the moments of perfection, that they didn't consider what happened between those points. "Thank you for the clarification," she said, then held up the marble one last time. "You know, in ancient human mythology, there's a story about a labyrinth that was supposedly perfect, unbeatable. But the hero won by understanding that the solution wasn't about following the maze. It was about thinking beyond it." With that, she released the marble, setting in motion a chain of events that would demonstrate exactly why humanity had survived every challenge it had ever faced, not through perfection, but through its mastery of imperfection. The marble left Sarah's hand in what appeared to be a simple, straight trajectory. For a fraction of a second, everything seemed normal, predictable even. Then chaos bloomed like a flower of pure mathematics. Between the first and second checkpoints, the marble began to vibrate in harmony with the station's subtle oscillations. This vibration, almost imperceptible at first, interacted with Vaxstar's crystalline structures in ways the Verax warrior hadn't considered possible. Each crystal began to resonate at its own frequency, creating a cascade of harmonics that rippled through the entire course. The alien audience watched in growing confusion as the marble's path became increasingly erratic. Yet somehow, it hit each checkpoint exactly as required, its speed matching the golden ratio progression perfectly at each measured point. Between those points, however, the marble danced and spiraled in ways that seemed to defy the established patterns. "Impossible." Vaxstar's crystalline form flashed with colors of agitation. "The trajectory violates the geometric requirements." "Does it?" Sarah asked calmly, watching as her marble completed another seemingly random series of movements before passing perfectly through the next checkpoint. "Check the measurements. At every point of validation, the marble is exactly where it should be, moving at exactly the right speed." The station's computers confirmed her words. Despite the apparent chaos of its path, the marble was technically fulfilling every single rule they had established. It was the space between the rules where Sarah had found her opportunity. "You've created disorder." The Verax warrior's voice reverberated with distress. "This is not the purpose of the pattern." Sarah kept her eyes on the marble as it approached one of the most complex crystal structures. "You assume disorder and pattern are opposites. But look closer. What you're seeing isn't disorder at all. It's a different kind of order. One that exists in the spaces between your perfect geometric shapes." The marble struck the crystal structure at precisely the right angle to set up a resonance cascade. The crystal began to sing, its harmonics spreading to the neighboring structures. Soon the entire course was humming with a complex symphony of vibrations, each one carefully calculated by Sarah's seemingly chaotic additions to the rule set. In nature, Sarah continued, her voice carrying over the crystalline harmonics. Perfect patterns are actually quite rare. What looks like chaos often contains hidden patterns, and what appears to be perfect order often breaks down into beautiful randomness. Humanity learned this lesson early in our development. We learned to see the patterns in chaos and the chaos in patterns. The marble was nearing the end of the course now, its dance becoming even more complex. Some of the alien delegates had moved to the edge of their viewing pods, completely entranced by the display. The marble wasn't just completing the course, it was turning the entire challenge into a performance of mathematical art. Your rules focused on the points of measurement, the moments of perfection, Sarah explained as the marble began its final approach. But life, intelligence, worth, these things don't exist in perfect moments. They exist in the spaces between, in how we handle the transitions, in how we adapt when things don't go according to plan. The marble struck the final checkpoint exactly as specified, then came to rest at the end of the course. The chamber fell silent except for the lingering harmonics of the crystal structures, which slowly faded into stillness. This was not combat, Vaxthar protested, though their voice carried a note of uncertainty now. This was not a demonstration of strength. Sarah walked over and picked up the marble, its surface now worn from its journey. Wasn't it? You wanted to test humanity's worth. Well, this is what makes humanity worthy. Not our ability to follow patterns, but our ability to understand them so completely that we can work between them, adapt them, transform them into something new. She held up the marble, letting it catch the light one more time. Every rule you added was about creating perfect, unbreakable patterns. Every rule I added was about understanding how patterns interact with reality. You saw the checkpoints as boundaries to be enforced. I saw them as reference points in a larger dance. The Verax delegation had fallen into complete silence, their crystalline forms shifting through colors that Sarah recognized as deep contemplation. They were beginning to understand that they had witnessed something beyond their traditional concept of combat or worth. They had seen a demonstration of humanity's greatest strength, the ability to find harmony between order and chaos. In the hours following the challenge, the ancient space station buzzed with activity unlike anything in its long history. Delegates from every species rushed to transmit their observations back to their homeworlds. The Verax delegation had withdrawn to their ship, their crystalline forms cycling through colors never before seen in their public presentations. Sarah stood at a viewing window in a quiet corridor, rolling the marble between her fingers as she watched the assembled ships against the backdrop of the Violet Nebula. Admiral Chen's hologram flickered beside her, his expression thoughtful as she finished her report. The Verax haven't emerged from their ship for 6 hours, he noted. Should we be concerned? Sarah shook her head, a slight smile playing at her lips. They're not planning anything hostile. They're restructuring. Restructuring. The Verax build their entire society on the idea that perfect patterns equal perfect strength. Today they saw something that contradicted everything they believed. She held up the marble, watching the nebula's light play through it. They're not just processing a defeat, they're processing a fundamental challenge to their worldview. As if on cue, a delegation of Verax emerged from their ship, their crystalline forms now showing entirely new geometric configurations. They approached the human transport with measured steps, led by Vaxthar, whose own crystal structure had transformed from its warrior configuration into something more complex, more organic. Commander Reeves, Vaxthar's voice carried none of its earlier martial tone. The Verax Council requests your presence. We have questions. The meeting chamber aboard the Verax vessel defied all of Sarah's expectations. Gone were the perfect geometric patterns that had dominated their earlier presentations. Instead, the walls flowed with crystalline structures that seemed to take inspiration from Earth's natural formations: snowflakes, river deltas, growing vines. We have reviewed the challenge multiple times. The Verax Council leader began. Our understanding remains incomplete. You could have won by simply exploiting the gaps in our rules, by finding technical violations that would force victory. Instead, you chose to create something that was simultaneously within our parameters and beyond our comprehension. Why? Sarah considered her words carefully. Because the true test wasn't about winning or losing. It was about understanding. You wanted to know humanity's worth. Our worth isn't in our ability to fight, or even in our ability to outsmart others. It's in our ability to take different ideas, different patterns, different ways of thinking, and create something new from them. She gestured to the transformed chamber around them. Look at what you've already created, just from beginning to question your own patterns. This is beautiful, and it's something uniquely Verax, but it came from being willing to see beyond the boundaries of what you thought was possible. The council leader's crystalline form shifted through a series of complex colors. We came seeking to test humanity's worth through combat. Instead, humanity has tested our understanding of worth itself. There was a pause, then. The Verax Empire formally recognizes humanity as equals. Moreover, we request an exchange of knowledge, not of weapons or technology, but of perspective. As Sarah prepared to leave the Verax vessel, Vaxthar approached her one final time. The warrior's form had continued to change, becoming something that bridged the gap between rigid geometry and flowing nature. The humans have a saying, Sarah said, noting the transformation. The only constant is change. We have much to learn from each other, Vaxthar responded. You fought without fighting, won without defeating, and taught without lecturing. This is a form of strength we had not considered possible. Sarah handed the warrior her marble. Here, a reminder that sometimes the simplest things can lead to the most profound changes. Back on the transport, setting course for Earth, Sarah recorded her final report. The marble's absence felt strange after carrying it for so long, but right. The Verax would spend years studying it, not for its physical properties, but for what it represented. The moment they learned that true worth isn't found in perfection, but in the willingness to grow beyond it. As her ship accelerated toward home, Sarah thought about how humanity's greatest victories had rarely come from overwhelming force or superior technology. They had come from our ability to adapt, to see patterns where others saw chaos, to find order in disorder, and perhaps most importantly, to recognize that the most beautiful patterns are often the ones that break the rules. In the end, the Verax had wanted to test humanity's worth through combat. Instead, humanity had shown them something far more valuable. That true worth lies not in the ability to maintain perfect patterns, but in the courage to transform them into something new. The violet nebula faded behind her ship, its swirling gases forming patterns that were simultaneously chaotic and ordered, complex and simple, ending and beginning. Just like the story of humanity's first true contact with the wider galaxy.